This is Groundeffected.
My name is your mom, and welcome to another packet of spaghetti with ketchup on top. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about how I painted Harlequin. And by talking about, what I actually mean is, I'm going to show you how I painted Harlequin. If you're new around here on this channel, I like to show you my process of painting 3D printed models. Oh my God, it nearly fell. But before we get on with the video, I'd like to ask you to go down to the bottom of this entire page of video and just in the little square box that YouTube allows you to leave some words, type a couple of words there, click the like button, and perhaps consider giving me a subscription. Because for every new subscriber that I get, I will have one more new subscriber. And of course, if you'd like to help me beat Uncle Algie, the rhythm, to make my videos seen by more people, these are the things you need to do in order to help me, bruh. And now I've spoken enough about nonsense, let's just get straight into painting Harlequin. Actually, before we do that, this was sculpted by VX Labs, which I will leave a link for this model in the description below, so if you would like to make one of your own, then of course you can find it in the description below. Something that I don't always show in the beginning of most of my videos is how I prepare the model before I start painting it. For this specific model, I'm going to need to add some magnets to it so that it's going to be easier for me to ship this model without it getting damaged in a box. Also, during this process, this is the time that I'm also going to take my time and sand off any areas that need to be smoothened. Sometimes there's a couple of layer lines that need to be softened out a little bit. When you're working on a project like this, there is always going to be marks from the supports. No matter how good you are, no matter how good your printer is, you're still going to have some kind of marks from the supports. So I'll go through and I'll clean them up. I'll use different tools like a knife, I'll use a toothbrush, sandpaper, sometimes just my finger, things like that. I'll just go through and clean up the entire model and get it ready for painting. For sticking in magnets, previously I used to use super glue. I've kind of changed away from using super glue and I now use a 5 or a 10-minute epoxy. I find this seems to hold them a lot better without them coming out. During the process of printing this model, one or two of the little pieces on her wrist snapped off, so I had to remodel them. I used green stuff for this. You just mix a yellow and a blue piece of epoxy putty kind of thing together and it makes an epoxy that dries hard, and you can use that to sculpt pieces or fill in holes and things like that. Once I had primed the piece and allowed it to dry, I then started off with the skin tones on this model. I started off with the skin tones mainly because I wanted to make sure that the tone of the skin was right for Harlequin. Usually my skin tones, I try to base it off of my own kind of complexion, and then I sort of change the hue or the range of the hue according to the character. Usually with female characters, I tend to make them a bit more pink, and for male characters, I tend to make them a little bit more bluish. But specifically on this model, I wanted to make sure that I got Harlequin's complexion right. She's super light, like she is really light, so I wanted to make sure I got that right, and I wanted to do that straight off the bat without having to come back later and fix that up. I use my usual method of painting skin tones. It is the Nocturna series of skin tones, which is called the Fairy Flesh set. I do have a link for that in the description if you'd like to get that. It is an Amazon affiliate link, so this does give a small kickback to the channel without any extra cost to you. So please make sure, if you do want to buy any of these products, there usually is a link for them in the description below. I continued building up the skin tones on Harley. For this one, I built really high up. I didn't normally do this on other pieces. I usually don't use the super light skin tone at the end as much as I did on her, but I wanted to exaggerate the fact that her skin tones are really light. Whilst it was drying, I pretty much had skin tone-ish colors out anyway, so I painted the baseball bat. It was just a base coat. I used a light brown, I used a dark brown to create some shadows on the lower end, and then a very light kind of skin tone color over the top end of it, just to create a good gradient throughout the bat, and then I used a wash over the top of all that just to tint it. Now for my famous grimoire purple over the skin. In Harley's case, I am going to use it, but not too much, because this darkens the skin. I do use it in the recesses or essentially in all the shadowed areas just to create some depth, but this is one of my super secret ways of creating a little bit more life in the skin. For Harley's tattoos, unfortunately they were not sculpted onto her body, so this meant I had to draw them on myself. I kind of dabbled with the idea of painting them with the brush, but screw that, I ended up drawing them on with a micro pen instead. For the stockings on her, they're fishnet stockings and they are sculpted, so this is super easy. This is the reason I painted the skin tones first, so that I could just come back with a nice large dry brush and dry brush black over the legs and pick up all the raised edges on the stockings in order to create the effect of the stockings. I had posted quite a few videos and pictures so far across my social medias, and everybody keeps asking me how did I do the stockings. Genuinely, that was the easiest part of this entire model. I would 100% say if you're going to paint this model to this level, including the tattoos, including a lot of pieces on this model that are really difficult to paint, I would say this is a higher level model to paint. It's not an easy model at all. So if you are tackling this model, take it bit by bit, take your time. It's not impossible to do, but it is going to take a little bit more patience and skill. Just take your time, you can do it. I masked off certain areas around the boots because I wanted to paint them white. I find painting that with a brush would take me absolutely days. I would genuinely have to do so many layers to get that white looking nice and crisp, so it's easier for me to just mask it off. I used liquid mask in the areas that were sort of difficult to mask around, and I just used a piece of cling film over the other areas just to cover up the rest of the model. I then airbrushed a bleach parchment kind of color, a very lightish color. It's not completely white, but I airbrushed this over all the parts that I wanted to appear white. Once I got a good solid base coat of this color down, I then took Apothecary White, which is a contrast paint, and I sprayed that from all the shadowed areas. So this is essentially from below everything. This is going to create a little bit of depth without being too dark and not too black. It's really difficult to highlight and shadow on white because you can end up going way too dark if you're not careful. But also, if you don't have a decent mid-tone, you're not going to have a good contrast between darks and lights. I then peeled off all of the liquid mask that I had placed on the body and all around the model so that I'm back to square one and I can start painting again with the brush in certain areas. I used a bit of post-attack to stick her little ponytails down onto my rotisserie painting majobby, and I painted them solid base coat, and then I went on to painting the wording that's across her t-shirt. This was also sculpted into the model, which extremely helps the fact that all I need to do is turn my hand to the side and catch the edges of these raised pieces with my brush. I have got a video on how to use a brush in this way. It is called brush control. I'm not really sure which one of it, but if you go back and look through my playlist, you will see an entire playlist of videos about brush control. I used metallics for the rest of the colors on her jacket and her pants. So instead of doing just a plain blue or just a plain red, I used metallic reds, knowing full and well that I'm going to paint over the top of this a matte clear coat anyway, so this will slightly dull the metallic finish and it won't look like metal, but it will have a tiny bit of that metallic flake in it, even though it has a dry brush over the top. For that marking that goes across the top of her shirt, the top of her shirt has this bit of red section, but it kind of fades out a little bit on the bottom of that red marking. So what I did was I watered down some reds and I painted them in maybe 3 layers going in, just so that I could build it up and it wasn't just a harsh line from where I ended the painting around the neck area of her t-shirt. I then went in with that same red and I painted the one half of her jacket and made sure that that was solid. This was one of the areas that was kind of difficult. You will see later in the video, I had to kind of squeeze my brush into areas that are really not easy to squeeze a brush into. I really wish some of these parts were actually separate, but unfortunately, this entire bust is just one big piece, which makes things extremely difficult for painting and cleanup, to be honest. For the flags, they were pretty simple. I decided to go with a white flag, black writing, and a red bang flash shape thing. So what I did was I painted the black on the inside first. Yes, this means it's a little bit more difficult to cover the black with the red. However, it's going to be a lot easier to do that way rather than try and put the black into the hole later. I mean, really, you can do it either way, but for me it worked out easy enough to do this. I used the darkish red at first, and then I took a lighter red and I kind of faded that from the top so that it had a slight gradient to it. So it wasn't just a plain solid red, it does have a gradient to it, and I just blended that in by watering down my red. Going back onto the torso again, I used bronze and a rich gold. I mixed the two together, probably about 70% bronze with 30% rich gold, and I painted this over all the metallic bits that are on her belt, specifically the studs that go all the way around and the little emblem in the front of her belt. I also used that same color on the zips of her jacket as well, and there is also a line that goes around the jacket that's kind of trimming on the jacket that I used that for, as well as her neck. There's a necklace thing on her neck that I used that for as well. I just filled in some of the gaps around the neck area just so that it wasn't like unpainted and look ugly when the head is off. And once I'd done all of that, I went in to start working on the base. The base is super simple. There is nothing crazy on the base, especially with the model with so much detail in it. The last thing you want to do is overdo the base. If you do too much work here, all you're going to do is draw your eye away from the character, and it's just unnecessary. I painted this in the same way that I paint rocks. I have a video. If you go back and look through my playlist, you will find that there is a video on how I paint rocks if you are interested in how I do that, with a little bit more in-depth talking about that. I do a couple of stages of layering where I do a lot of the colors first with a blend. It's a wet blend at first. I then layer over the top of that a wash. This is just to tint the colors. I then also do a dry brush on top of that, and then I tint it again, and then I dry brush that again, and I tint certain areas, and then just pick up some edges with the dry brush. It is maybe slightly long-winded, but it doesn't take too long, and I really enjoy painting rocks anyway, so doing it that way is really fun for me. I painted the rim of the base, the bottom rim of the base with a black, and then I painted the metallic pieces on the top of the base. I started with a dark silver around the outer edge, and I felt like to break it up a little bit and also to tie in some of the golds that are on her body, I'm going to use that brass in the center as well. It's the same brass and rich gold mix that I used on the other accessories that are on her belt and other parts of the model. I painted these flat. I felt like they didn't need to have too much to them. I didn't want to create gradients or anything crazy. I just wanted to be super simple. I then sprayed that with a gloss clear varnish. The reason I use glass is because we have metallic parts on here. I don't want to lose the shine on them. But in order to make the rocks not look like they're wet, I used a matte clear varnish over the top of that, and that I just brushed on with the brush. I then went back in to do a load more trimming and stuff on the main torso of the body. This is just taking my time to make sure that a lot of things are tidy and catching all the little bits and pieces that are on her body. I then started working on the boots, which arguably are probably the next most difficult thing on this model. There are some really complicated shapes on these boots and really small areas that you need to get a brush into. However, if you use a small enough brush and just take your time, make sure to pay attention to where those colors are, because the last thing you want to be doing at this point is trying to paint white back over the top of black if you do paint the wrong area black. However, if you do, it's your own model. You can just change up the style of the shoe slightly if you wanted to, but in my case, I just paid really careful attention to what the shoes look like in pictures, and I painted them according to what I saw. I then started on the portrait of the model, and for this I just painted the base coat of her hair, and while that was drying I started to work on her lipstick. The one side of her lipstick is smudged in almost all the images that you see, so in order to create that effect I painted it on, and while it was still wet I mushed it a little bit with the paintbrush just to kind of smudge it. It feels really weird to do this. I would never do this in any other situation, but just to create that effect, that's what I did. For eyebrows, I used a super thin brush, and I just kind of tossed in a couple of eyebrows just to make it not look like a solid friggin' caterpillar over her eye and give it a little bit more texture to her face. I then painted the blush. She has two different color blushes underneath each eye. Once I had done that, then I started to work on the tattoos on her face. Again, another really difficult thing to do. However, it wasn't too complicated. Just pretty much write the word rotten down her chin and put a little heart on her cheek. Not too difficult. I then worked on her eyes. This is simple. I do this with every single model. You can see this in all my videos. I paint a black base coat, and while that was drying, I then worked on a little bit of dry brushing in the hair. Nothing too crazy. I pretty much didn't want to draw too much attention away from her face and the details within her torso and on her legs, her tattoos, the shoes. These are the kind of things that were the details for me. For her hair, I just watered down a pink and I watered down a light blue, and I painted the edges or the bottom edges of her little ponytails or pigtails, whatever you want to call them. These are only press fit in at the moment. I didn't actually manage to fit a magnet in there. Not that I was even going to try, because I was way too afraid I'd split the resin. So probably either going to glue those in, or I'm just going to leave them separate if I ship the model. For the eyes, what I ended up doing was painting in a white, and then unfortunately in this model there is a sculpt around where the pupil and the iris is. This really irritates me a little bit because I don't like to be dictated where the irises and the pupils go, and it also tends to make the eyes a little bit weird and bulgy, so I don't like that specifically, but perhaps you might like that. It may be a little bit easier for you to place the eyes where they should be. However, I prefer it to be placed by myself. I prefer a smooth eyeball that I can just put the eye looking in the direction that I want it to be. For the baseball bat, again, none of the details on this baseball bat are sculpted onto it. So if you want any of these details, you're going to have to draw or paint this all on by hand. And I'm not going to lie, this was the next thing that was extremely difficult to work on. Yes, I used the micron pen, and yes, that made it slightly easier. It still was not easy. I ended up doing this twice because the first time I did it, it looked like absolute dog's poo-poo, and so I ended up redoing this anyway, and this is kind of the result that I ended up having. I also did, instead of actual text, I just did little squiggles, but essentially I imagined myself writing swear words to the person who sculpted this about not freaking sculpting that detail onto the bat. There's also a little bit of trimming around the bottom of the design area, which is essentially a load of just red triangles with blue diamonds in between them. I did the red triangles first and then the blue diamonds after. It was way too difficult to do it the other way. Trust me, I already tried. And after that, I just called it done. You figured out something in this video that makes your next print and paint a little bit easier and a little bit more confidence in painting the next model. And if there's something you would like to see highlighted in a future video, make sure to leave that in the comment section below. I'd like to say a special thanks to my patrons for the support they give me, and it is because of their support that I have these lights blinding my eyeballs during my videos. If you would like to be part of the Patreon, where you get access to the private Discord, where you don't get told stupid things like you do on Facebook, when you ask questions or technical questions about printing and painting, then the best thing you can do is obviously join the Patreon. And if you would like to support the videos and you're not committed to a monetary kind of support, then the next best thing you can do is like the video, share it with your gran, and watch the next video that's suggested at the end of this one. Of course, if you happen to make it this far into one of my videos, I nearly knocked the model over again, but we'll pretend that didn't happen. If you didn't like anything you saw in the video, it's pretty simple really. All you gotta do is click the dislike button and then f*** off. One of these days I'm actually gonna knock a model over and it's not gonna be funny. Make good content though.